Hello Internet, this is Iron Gut, and this is a tutorial that I was requested to make about how to make a stepped animation for inflation on avatars, like I did with the Reyes Renamon avatar commission. This I'm going to use the Milo's raccoon as a base because it's a base that's available everywhere, and I've already modified this base to have some large inflation shapes, such as this one. So once you've done that, I'm going to assume that you guys know how to set up a blend shape. Let's set up the actual animation. So I've already added an animation controller onto here, and under there, it goes normally into the effects layer. I'm also adding it to the controller so that I can click here and it'll show up in the animator. So the first thing we need to do is set up the base animation. Now, the way we do this is we're going to go to parameters and set up some parameters first. Inflation float. This is going to be the float number that defines from 0 to 100 exactly how inflated the character is going to be. And how we're going to use that, of course, is in a blend tree. So you're going to right click, create state, new blend tree. It's going to pop that up for you. You're going to double click to enter it, then click there, and it should automatically choose that parameter for you, inflation float. If you have multiple parameters set up, you would need to, of course, choose the one that you want to use. And then we're going to add 2 motion fields to it. And we need to create animations for those motion fields. So in your project folders, you're going to right click, create, animation, right there. This is going to be size min, and then we're going to create another one, size max, naturally. And then in the blend tree, we just drag and drop them into places, minimum on the top, maximum on the bottom, for a scale of 0 to 1. Now to actually record what those animations are going to do. So we're going to go into our animations tab here, and you can see that I can choose between the two now, size min and size max. For size min, it's pretty much already set up, but just to make sure, we're going to have this set to 0. And we did that by hitting the record button, going to the body, and setting the blend shape that we want to set down to the value that we want. In this case, 0, because the minimum is going to be not inflated. So we end the recording, and then we go to size max, record, and once again now, we're going to set this blend shape to the maximum value that we want right there. Don't worry about how the avatar is shifted down or anything at the moment. That's irrelevant. Just don't worry about it. So now that that's done, that's pretty much it. That's how you set up the floating animation, and this is also how you would do setting up a menu to manually control this. Under VRchat avatars expressions menu, and create VRchat avatars expressions parameters. And under parameters, we're going to add a float that matches this one, inflation float. Same capitalization and everything. And we're going to drag this into the parameters slot here of the VRC avatar descriptor, and the expressions menu onto there. And then we can click on the animations menu and add a control, which will be a radial puppet that controls the inflation float, and we'll call that inflation amount, or whatever you want to label it as. This is going to give you a menu in your emote wheel that will give you that radial slider to control. That's part 1 all set, and now we're going to create the stepped animation to automatically inflate an avatar. So to do that, we're going to need to make a couple more parameters. First off, if you can use a bool, use a bool, because that's a true and false value, If bool is not available and you're using an older version of Unity, just use an integer that can set to either 0 or 1. But what we're going to do is we're going to make inflate plus plus as a bool, and we're going to have it mirrored in the expression parameters as well. Inflate plus plus, and this will set to bool, and it'll be false. Now, what we're going to do with this is we're going to create a new layer, stepped animation. We're going to create a new state empty. That's just a blank slate. And what we're going to, of course, also set the weight to 1. Because if its weight is at 0, that means it's going to affect nothing. So you want the weight to be 1, that way it actually affects things. Now, we're going to right-click and create another empty state. And this is where we're going to start labeling things. We're going to start labeling this inflation stepped normal. And now the way that we're going to get the animation to step is with a behavior on this animation state. So we're going to add behavior and VRC avatar parameter driver. This right here is what we're going to use to actually change the float value whenever we click the button. See, when you add a parameter, you can change this to add, and you can, of course, have it set to inflation float. And this way, whenever an animation passes through this animation state, it's going to add whatever value we set here to inflation float. So now floats, I said they operate on a 0 to 100 scale. They actually do that by a 0 to 1 scale with decimals. So in order to make this, we need to make a decimal value. Say if we want 10 steps to the animation, then we're going to add 0.1, which is the equivalent of 10%, 1/10, 10 steps. If you wanted to make it 100 button presses to get to 100%, you would make it 0.01. But I personally think that's too many, so I like to set at 10. And then we're going to have this make a transition into here, and this transition is going to, now we're going to disable the exit time by changing it to 0 and unchecking has exit time. What exit time does is it means that whenever something enters this animation state right here, it's going to automatically exit into the next path. We don't want that. We want this path to only be taken into the actual inflation step when the condition is met that we hit the inflate button. So whenever inflate plus plus equals true, that's what we're going to do. Is in the menu you'll see there's going to be a type button, inflate 10%, and its parameter is going to be inflate plus plus bool. So what this means is that whenever we click this button, it's going to set inflate plus plus to true, which means that it's going to transition from here, which is our base state, into the normal inflation stepped state, which is going to add 10% to inflation float. You get how this works? And the last thing to worry about with this transition is the transition duration, which means how long does it take to add that 10%. In which case, we're going to do it a quarter of a second looks fine. This is measured in seconds, by the way, so I could make it take 1 second or half a second. 0.25 is the default that it usually sets. 0.25 is fine. So what we're going to do now is once we've set this parameter driver, what we need it to do after that is set inflation plus plus back to 0. Otherwise, if we don't do that and we just loop it back, it's going to create an endless loop because inflate plus plus, You know, if you're holding the button, it'll send it on an endless loop. You don't want that. So we're gonna have it as soon as it does that 10%, it goes back, and we do that by setting inflate plus plus to 0. And this transition here that we've made to go back to the waiting state, we're going to have it take an exit time of 0 and have it have an exit time, which means that as soon as it's done playing this animation, which adds that and sets that, it's going to send it right back to the base state. And transition time, yeah, we can let it take 0.25 seconds. It really doesn't matter. And that right there is pretty much it. With this state, you can then add an animation into it that does something like play a sound. For example, set animation, play sound. We drag this in here, and then we need to actually create a sound for it to play. Audio source, add component onto the bottom of that, VRC audio, VRC spatial audio source. Always add this to your audio sources and make sure that it uses audio source volume curve. Spatial blend is set to 3D. And those settings will make it so that the sound that is played from the avatar decreases the further away you get from the avatar. Because otherwise, it'll just play at max volume for everyone throughout the world. And that, I can tell you as a VRC player, is annoying. Always set your spatial audio sources. Always. And then you can drag whatever MP3 you want in here. I don't have one available at the moment, but let's just pretend that I drag. There's an inflation sound effect in there now. And all we need to do now is go back to the animations tab, play sound, and record the audio source turning on, and have it set to play on wake, which it is. And there you go. And make sure it's not looping. It isn't. And there you go. Now, make sure that we're not recording and have this turned off by default. So now, whenever we hit that button, it's going to play the sound effect. It's going to add 10% onto the inflation float. And that's pretty much it. Now, the problem here right now is that this doesn't have a way to detect when you've reached the maximum of 100%. It'll just keep adding 10% over and over and over again. So what you need to do now is set it to actually have a detection system on it. So what we do in order to do that is we have another condition on this entrance here. This being when inflation float is less than 0.9. And let's make it 0.91 just in case. Because remember, we're adding 10% each time. So if inflation float is at 0.9 and we add 10%, it's going to reach 100%. So if it's over 0.9 and we add another 0.1 onto it, that'll be more than 1. So we don't want it to be able to do that. So this here makes sure that it does not follow this path if you click the inflate button, and by doing so, it would make it more than 100%. Instead, what we can do is now we could add, if you want, say a bursting animation, and set this to have no exit time because we don't need that. And we're going to have inflation float greater than 0.9. We don't need to be 0.91 because that's to detect, because this is the reason we made this 0.1 is so that 0.90 is acceptable. This 0.90 is our maximum, so anything greater than 0.9 is what we want to accept. And when we've hit inflate plus plus. So now, if we're in the base state and we hit the inflate plus plus button and we're at 90%, it'll go to the bursting animation, which you can set to be whatever kind of animation you want, whether you're going to turn on a particle effect, whether you're just going to make the avatar disappear by turning off its mesh like that, or any number of things. It'll send it to that animation and that'll play. And in there, we're going to add a behavior parameter driver. We're going to add a parameter. And by the way, this local only, this means that when you play the animation, it will, or whenever you click through, it's only going to affect you, your vision in the world. Nobody else will be able to see it. So don't click local only. Anyways, because this is the bursting animation, we want it to set the inflation float back to 0. So inflation float set back to 0. And we can also, of course, not forget to set the inflate plus plus to 0. And then we add a transition back here to the waiting state with an exit time of 0. And it really doesn't matter. And there you go. That's how you would set up a bursting animation. Pretty simple. It's all with parameter drivers. Now, if you want to set up so that you push a button and it inflates automatically on a loop, well, that's what's next. So in order to do this, we're going to need to set another bool, because we cannot have it run through these guys. We need to have it set through another animation state. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to parameters, and we're going to create a new bool called inflate auto. And we're going to, of course, mirror that in the expression parameters. Inflate auto will be a bool. Automatic inflation. And this will be a toggle to auto inflate, because we want the automatic inflation to be turn on and turn off. Or you could set it to a button, and that way it'll it'll only go as long as you're holding the button down, which also works. I say a toggle is easier though, more user friendly. And what you need to do now is create another state. This one, auto inflate, and it will have a transition that is set to 0 exit time, transition duration. Now this one, the transition duration is going to be really important, because when you have this set to detect inflate auto equals true and inflate float is equal to 0.99, less than 0.99 that is, we're going to add the behavior of parameter drivers and add how much of a percentage per how many seconds. This is where you need to actually time things out. You know, it's like, okay, how long do you want it to take to reach 100%? Do you want it to take 10 seconds? Do you want it to take 100 seconds? Do you want it to take 30 seconds? You need to do a little bit of calculation here in order to divide, you know, how many percentage points per second you are going to inflate it by. In this case, let's make it nice and simple. Let's make it 1 second and 10%. So it's going to go 10% per second. So it'll take 10 seconds to reach 100%. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, because this is going to be an auto inflate, we're not going to have it set the inflate auto back to 0, because that will just mean that it ends the loop. Instead, this loop is going to continue to go exit time of 0, duration time of 0, and now this loop will continue to loop around so long as so long as inflate auto equals true. Now, once again, because this is going to be set to 10% every second, this will be less than 0.91 again, or 0.91 again. But that's also a pretty heavy step. So we can actually make it better. We can make it so that the transition duration equals 0.1 second instead of 1 second, and make auto inflate 0.01 instead of 0.1. So now, instead of it looping once every second and taking 10% added on, it's going to loop 10 times per second, each time adding 1% instead of 10%. And that way now we can set the detector to detect a much more refined amount of 0.99 instead of, instead of 0.91. So that'll go like that. So this will loop until it reaches 100%. Now, one of the things that Reyes has is that when you have the auto inflate turn on and it reaches 99%, it'll go into an animation whereby it's going in and out, wobbling back and forth, basically overinflated, stressing, about to burst. To replicate that, you need to make another animation file here, about to burst. And we're going to drag that in here. And this will have another set of animations on it that is going to read inflate auto equals true, and inflation float is greater than 0.98. So, if the auto inflate is on and it reaches 0.99, because here we're setting it to less than 0.99, here greater than 0.98. So when it reaches 0.99, it will not go to auto inflate, it'll go to about to burst. This does not have an exit time, and its transition duration really doesn't matter because about to burst is going to be the animation that it plays. And now what we're going to do is whenever we're in the about to burst phase and we click on inflate plus plus, it goes to the bursting animation. It's not going to have an exit time, and it's not going to have a zero, and it's not going to have a duration. It's just going to go straight there to bursting. And in bursting, we're also going to set the inflate auto to 0 now. So once it's in auto inflate and it reaches about to burst, we leave auto inflate on, and then it goes to bursting animation when we click inflate one more time. Boom. And the about to burst animation, now we just record what that's going to be and look like. In this case, we're going to record its body is going to look like this, and then a few frames, let's say 3 frames, goes to 95%, and then back to 100%. And then we make sure that this animation loops. And now, what it's going to look like is this. That's what the about to burst animation would look like. And we could set another audio source on it if we want that has a stretching balloon sound effect that loops or whatever you'd like. This is what the about to burst state will look like. Minus the pose that he's in, because the pose, this is just a standard pose. And, yeah, that should pretty much cover everything. Auto inflate equals true. Inflation is greater than. Inflate exits automatically. Exits automatically. Exits automatically. This, once we're in about to burst, will only be exitable by hitting inflate equals true. Or we could make it also escape the about to burst state by detecting that the inflation float is less than 0.94 or less than 0.95. So if you set via the wheel to manually shrink down, it'll exit about to burst. So don't worry about exit time. Don't worry about duration. That's pretty much it. Um, yeah. Also, just in case, the about to burst state, we're also going to add a parameter driver onto it to turn off auto inflate. Because otherwise, it's going to burst, head back, and auto inflate will still be turned on, and it'll start auto inflating again. So we want it to enter about to burst, hit the bursting animation, and then be back at the default waiting state. So we need to set inflate auto to off. And this is where we're getting into programming. You need to think about every variable and where everything is at each and every state. And yeah, with that, I think this is done. Yeah. And you can, by the way, set up as many of these as you like. You can set up this whole system again, either on another layer for the sake of making things nice and tidy, or on the same layer, and have them set for different body parts. For example, this inflation is taking place entirely via the fat belly slider, but we can also make one that would auto-inflate the thighs or auto-inflate, those shins there. It can be done for anything. Hell, this sort of stepped animation can be used for things aside from just inflation and blend shapes. It can be set to do things like move a seat around on an avatar, because you can change its XY positions, and thus you can make a seat that moves around on your avatar when you click a button. It can be used in a number of creative ways, but it all comes down to having these parameter drivers. And with that, yeah, you're basically all set. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and make sure that this animator goes on your effects layer, otherwise it will not work correctly. And enjoy VRchat.